Okay, so let's talk about emotions for a second. Okay. So here's what's crazy is that like with me growing up and being raised and going through childhood, teenager, all these kinds of things, I do what a lot of specifically men do, of where I compartmentalize and I tuck things deep down and I don't display a lot of emotions. I'm not a very emotional person. And I've also developed this thing, which actually I do think is true, is that emotions are very, very, very dangerous. And when you're emotional, like I have this thought process, right? That when you're emotional, you make irrational decisions that are short-term based. They aren't taking a larger scope entails, right? And so I take that sentence, that reasoning that sounds very like it makes sense to like this extreme of that means I can't show any emotions at all.
Right.
And I can't cry and I can't show any of that, right? And that has been a very, very, and like it, what, I don't know where it came from. Like, you know, I think my dad is that way, but I think a lot of men are that way. And I don't exactly know why. And I think there are cultural and societal things of if you cry, you're not a man. You're a child. You're showing a feminine thing, right? Or I remember, playing baseball and like keeping playing through games when I probably shouldn't have because I couldn't show that I was in pain, right? Or I didn't want to show that I was in pain.
Yeah.
And I think that all of that comes back to a very interesting point now because I have two boys as kids. And I have to try very, very consciously to explain to them that the way that I treat my emotions, I don't actually think is right. And I think that they will grow up to be better men if they are like, in tune is a weird word, but like in tune with their emotions and not just hiding all of their emotions away.
And I think that there's something that if we actually zoomed out and looked evolutionarily, like through history, the last couple thousand years, like the world was, no matter what you think, like it was a much more violent place, more common. It was more common for violence. And it has progressively, thank God, like gotten less in certain areas, some, not across the board. And so I think like evolutionarily, is that the word I'm looking for?
Historically?
Yeah, but like it is I think for males throughout history, in our genes, it's like, it is a very hard world.
Yes.
It is a violent world.
Yes.
And ideally, like we progress through generations. And the world turning less like violent is a relatively new thing. Maybe 100 years.
Yes. Depending on where you're at in the world.
Depending on where you're at, but at large.
Yes.
Like we have like, and so I always look at like with the context of even like, looking at my father and how I was raised. And then if I zoom out and look at it, it's like, well, what was his situation? How was masculinity displayed to my father? And the answer to that is my dad didn't have a relationship with his father growing up and had a stepfather figure that 100% was abusive and did things that, like, in my experience, like he's never done those things to me. So like, however, I could look at like physical punishment was part of my life growing up. But like, if I looked at the progression, it's like, man, like if my dad received this level of abuse, and I hope he's okay with me sharing that, but I would say like he was a better father than whatever. He showed me a better form of masculinity than what was shown to him. And my goal would be to show my child a better form or a healthier form of masculinity that was shown. So it's not about being perfect or right or wrong. No. And it's about like acknowledging I don't want to put any blame on past generations because the world has changed and it's better. I wish people treated women the same way they do today in 1919.
Right.
But that's not reality, and that's not the world we live in, and we can't like deny the fact that happened.
Right.
But if we say that there hasn't been any progression, like
Right.
that's also not true either.
Right. And I think that like when you start looking at that, like historically and contextually and how things have changed in the world over thousands of years, I think it's also really interesting because I had this thought of like, 2,000 years ago, I mean, biblical times, like wars, people fighting, people overtaking everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Jewish people were overtaken like 17 times, like they were conquered like a million times just in the Bible, right? Yeah. And it was the men who were fighting. And there also, then there comes into play of like, we're talking about this emotion, like I was talking about emotions, right? Of how if you are on a battlefield and you're fighting somebody.
Yeah.
And you don't show pain and you don't, you're hurt, but you don't show that to anybody. There's a lot of mental like games that are being played with whoever your opponent is, right? And the same thing on the basketball court, the same thing like now here today in sports or whatever it is of like you're frustrated, you're upset, you're physically hurt. If you don't show that,
stay composed. Yeah.
It gives you a legs up, like it helps you. You know what I mean? And it's crazy of how, you look at even like, I mean, this is like a weird out of left park, but you look at like, have you ever done any research or read like on Sparta, like the Spartans? And how
besides 300,
right? I mean,
because I've seen the front kick,
right? Yeah, yes, exactly. But like how they raised boys, very specifically.
Yeah.
And the Spartans were also cool because of their beliefs in women, and they thought that women were the strongest because they gave birth to Spartan men, which is like really cool thing. But how they very specifically raised them, and throughout history of, if you didn't show anything, you were stronger. And now it comes into play of like, now in like a daily life. And is that really needed or healthy?
Yeah. There's a line, I think, because there are moments where, I mean, I think even professionally and stuff, like we're in a spot like where it's like, it is the right thing for me to do to compose my emotions and not, especially if you're a leader in a certain sense, to exhibit a behavior that is not emotionally driven, to remove emotions from the conversation and be able to come back down to, because like you said, emotions can be dangerous. Emotions are charged. And when most of the things you say that you regret, you were probably emotional when you said them.
Right.
So it doesn't, and I mean, you can say beautiful things off of emotion as well, but, yeah, I think it's about control. And so is that needed today? In some ways, yes. Not to the same capacity or the level that I think you're referring to.
Right. I think like, and how do we take all of this back to the desire and need to fix things? How does it all play into each other?
I don't know. If I'm being honest, I want to go back to something you said. I'm sorry.
Let's go
Can
back.
we go back?
Let's go back.
You talked about growing up and like the experience of you having boys now, and recognizing the fact that now you are the model of, or one of the biggest models in your boy's life of what masculine behavior is like, and thinking about, so like, what are the things consciously that you are trying to make sure you show them that a man can and should do in a healthy way?
It's a loaded question. I think one thing I'm going through with my 3-year-old right now is through like talking to him, but also in times where like discipline is needed. I think it's trying to teach him and explain to him that like whining and screaming and crying because you're not getting what you want is not okay. But if you are hurt, then crying is okay. And I very, very consciously he has taken things of where like he's done something and I've taken him to timeout. I'm like, buddy, do you know why you're in timeout? And he will go, because I was crying. And I go, no. Yeah. That's not why you're in timeout.
Yeah.
And then like I have to have, like I sit there and have a conversation with him, because I don't ever want that to be his mindset and be like a, especially as he's turning from like a toddler into like a child.
Yeah.
And developmentally, the things that he's establishing and learning right now are going to carry him for years and years and years and years. And so if he comes to this conclusion through my actions or what I say or what my wife says or my wife's actions of where crying is negative, then I'm not even doing it from like, oh, you need to be a man standpoint. Like, I'm just teaching him something that I think could in the future turn into something that could be very toxic.